I signed the divorce papers before I understood what I was really agreeing to. That is the part people always pause at when I tell this story. They wait for an explanation that sounds emotional or chaotic. They expect tears-raised voices, maybe a dramatic fight. None of that happened. What happened was quieter, and in many ways worse. The morning my parents asked me to end my marriage, the coffee on the kitchen counter had already gone cold. My mother had reheated hers twice. My father never touched his. They were sitting side by side at my dining table, not across from each other, but angled toward me like a panel that had already reached a decision. "We need you to be practical," my mother said. Her voice was calm, careful, the same voice she used with customer service representatives and church friends. "This isn't about feelings." I remember thinking that was strange. No one had mentioned feelings yet. My husband Aaron was not there. He had left early for work, kissed my cheek, and reminded me to call the plumber. We had been married for just under 3 years. No kids, no scandals, no violence, no infidelity. Just a quiet life that until that morning I believed was stable. My father cleared his throat. "Aaron made a promise to us." I waited. Silence has always been my instinct. People tend to fill it for you. He told us, my mother continued, that once things picked up at his firm, he would help us. A significant amount. A way of saying thank you for welcoming him into this family. I asked how much. $1 million, my father said, as if he were stating the weather. He did not look embarrassed. He did not look unsure. He looked inconvenienced, like someone explaining a delay. I nodded once, not agreement, processing. "And now?" I asked. My mother folded her hands. "Now he's changed his tone. He says it will take time. Years even. That he has responsibilities. A mortgage. A wife." She said wife like it was an obstacle. I asked the only question that mattered. "What does this have to do with me?" They exchanged a glance. A small one, but practiced. I had seen it my entire life without realizing what it was. "We think," my father said slowly, "that you should step away from this marriage. Temporarily, if you want to frame it that way. But legally." "So a divorce," I said. "Yes." The word sat between us, heavy, final. "You want me to divorce my husband because he didn't give you money?" I said. My mother corrected me gently. "Because he broke a promise. Because this shows his character. Because you deserve better." That was the first time I noticed the shift, the way they wrapped control in the language of care. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I asked what they would do if I didn't. My father leaned back in his chair. "Then we would have to reconsider certain arrangements. Support. Involvement. The safety net you've always had." I was 31 years old. I had my own income, my own apartment before marriage, my own life. And yet in that moment, the threat landed exactly where it was meant to. Family is not just love, it is infrastructure. And they knew where the beams were. I asked for time. They gave me 2 weeks. I did not tell Aaron right away. That is the part I am least proud of, but also the most honest. I needed to understand the shape of what was happening before I let it destroy someone else. During those 2 weeks, my parents called every other day, not to pressure me directly, but to remind me of everything they had ever done for me. College tuition, emergency loans, holidays at their house, introductions to people who mattered. None of it was exaggerated, that was the problem. It was all real, and it was all conditional. On the 14th day, I sat across from a divorce attorney whose office smelled like lemon cleaner and old paper. She asked me if I was being coerced. I said no. That was not entirely true, it just wasn't legally false. When I told Aaron that evening, he stared at me like I was speaking another language. "They're asking you to choose," he said slowly. "And you're choosing them." "I'm choosing stability," I said. He nodded once. I watched something close behind his eyes. He did not fight me. He did not beg. He asked one question. "Is this really what you want?" I told him yes. The divorce was finalized faster than I expected. Clean, efficient, no assets to divide worth mentioning. When it was over, my parents took me to dinner. My mother squeezed my hand across the table. "You did the right thing," she said. 2 weeks later, my grandfather died. I hadn't seen him in nearly a year. Not because of conflict, because my parents had always managed the distance. He lived in a different state on a property people like to call a ranch, even though it was closer to an estate. Old money, quiet money. I flew out for the funeral alone. After the service, a man I didn't recognize asked to speak with me privately. He introduced himself as my grandfather's attorney. His voice was formal, respectful. He asked if I knew why my grandfather had updated his will 6 months earlier. I said no. He smiled thinly. Then I think you should sit down. That was the moment. The exact moment. Sitting in a leather chair that was too soft, listening as a stranger explained that I was the sole beneficiary of an estate worth $200 million, that I understood something fundamental had shifted. Not because of the money, but because of the timing, and because my parents had no idea. The attorney slid a folder toward me. Your grandfather was very clear. This is yours, and only yours. As I signed the acknowledgement of receipt, my phone buzzed in my purse. A message from my mother. Did you land safely? I looked at the screen, then at the signature bearing my name. And for the first time since the kitchen table, I didn't answer right away. Because the question I was finally asking myself was no longer how to keep everyone else comfortable. It was how much silence I had left before I chose myself. I did not tell my parents about the will. Not because I was plotting anything yet. Not because I felt clever or strategic. I didn't tell them because the information didn't feel like mine to give. For the first time in my life, something existed that had not passed through their approval, their framing, or their expectation. That silence felt fragile. I wanted to understand it before I broke it. The attorney suggested I stay an extra few days to review documents, valuations, and timelines. The estate was complex. Multiple properties, a controlling interest in a private investment firm, long-standing trusts that had been quietly accumulating for decades. My grandfather had lived simply, but not modestly. The money had always been there, just never discussed. I stayed. Each morning I woke in the guest room of his house, the one I used to sleep in as a child. Same creaking floorboard near the door. Same view of the old oak tree outside the window. The familiarity unsettled me more than the numbers ever could. My parents called every day. They asked how I was holding up, whether I needed them to fly out, whether I had spoken to the attorney. They were careful not to ask directly about the will. That restraint told me everything. They assumed that whatever existed would pass through them first. Assumed that I was still the intermediary, the extension, the asset they had always managed. On the third day, my mother's tone shifted. You sound different, she said, distant. I'm tired, I replied, which was true. You know, she continued, if there's anything complicated with your grandfather's affairs, your father can help. These things can get overwhelming. I pictured my father's expression at the kitchen table. The way he spoke about $1 million like it was already his. I'm handling it, I said. A pause, barely perceptible, but there. Of course, she said, we just worry. Worry. Another word they used the way other people used leverage. When I returned home, my apartment felt smaller, quieter. Aaron's things were already gone. He had been efficient, kind even in his absence. He left a note in the kitchen drawer folded neatly. I hope you find what you're looking for. I didn't know if that was forgiveness or resignation. I didn't unfold it again. The first letter from my grandfather arrived a week later. It had been written by hand months before his death. The attorney had held it back until the will was executed. He said my grandfather had been specific about timing. The letter was short. He wrote that he had watched me grow up more than I realized, that he noticed who spoke for me and who listened, that he admired patience but did not confuse it with passivity. He said the inheritance was not a reward but a correction. That sentence stayed with me. A correction implies an error, not a punishment, not a gift, just a recalibration. I read the letter twice, then placed it back in the envelope and locked it in the small safe at the back of my closet. The same safe my parents didn't know existed. 2 days later, my father called. We've been thinking, he said, skipping any preamble. With the divorce finalized, you're in a transitional phase. It might make sense for you to move back home for a while. I imagined my childhood bedroom, the door that never quite closed, the house where privacy had always been presented as something earned, never assumed. I'm not moving, I said. He sighed, the sound sharp with disappointment. You're being stubborn. I'm being settled. Settled into what he asked. You don't even have a husband anymore. The words landed harder than he probably intended, or maybe exactly as intended. I have a job, I said. I have plans. You have no family of your own, my mother said, joining the call without announcement. And that matters. There it was, the reframe. Divorce as deficiency, independence as absence. I am your family, I said. They did not respond right away. When my mother spoke again, her voice was cooler. We're only trying to guide you. You've always needed structure. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was accurate in the way a diagnosis is accurate after the damage is done. I ended the call early, claimed another meeting, sat on my couch long after the screen went dark. That night, I opened a new email account. I contacted a different law firm, one my parents had no relationship with. I scheduled a consultation, not about the estate, about boundaries. The lawyer I met with was younger than I expected, sharp, direct. She asked me what I wanted. I told her I wanted control. She nodded. Then the first thing we do is reduce access. We discussed communication limits, legal firewalls, what information my parents were entitled to, which as it turned out was nothing. The next time my parents called, I didn't answer. I waited an hour, then two, then a full day. When I finally returned the call, I was polite, warm even, but brief. I'm busy, I said. I'll check in when I can. My mother sounded startled. My father sounded irritated. You don't get to shut us out, he said. I looked around my apartment, at the quiet, at the absence of anyone else's expectations. I already have, I replied. That night alone, I poured a glass of wine and stood by the window. The city lights flickered below. Somewhere inside me, something long suppressed began to shift. Not anger, not vengeance. Clarity. They had taught me how to survive by compliance. My grandfather had given me the means to choose otherwise. And for the first time since the divorce papers, I wasn't reacting. I was deciding. The first time I realized my parents were searching for information, not connection, was during a voicemail my mother didn't mean to leave. She called while I was in a meeting. I watched her name light up. My phone felt the familiar pressure to excuse myself and chose not to. When the meeting ended, I saw the voicemail notification and played it without much thought. At first it was the usual, my name. A soft sigh, then a pause. Did you hear anything? She whispered, not to me. No, she hasn't said a word. I don't like this. Another pause, papers shifting, a chair scraping. She's always been terrible at hiding things. This silence means something. The call ended abruptly, no goodbye. I sat there for a long moment, phone in my hand, listening to the empty room. I had known intellectually that my parents were strategic people. They planned. They anticipated. What I had never allowed myself to see was that I was part of that planning. Not as a person, but as a variable. That afternoon, I forwarded the voicemail to my lawyer. She responded with one sentence. Document everything. From that point on, I did. I saved texts. I archived emails. I wrote down dates and times, not because I intended to use them, but because I needed to see the pattern laid out clearly without my childhood instinct to excuse it. The calls became more frequent, not overtly aggressive, just persistent, questions disguised as concern. Have you heard from the attorney again? Are there any updates with your grandfather's affairs? We're worried you're being taken advantage of. That one almost made me smile. The irony was sharp enough to be funny if I allowed it. At work, I kept my routine. I showed up on time. I met deadlines. I accepted a promotion I had been offered months earlier but delayed out of habit. I stopped asking my parents' opinion before making decisions. Each small act felt like stepping onto ice that didn't crack. One evening, my brother called. We had never been close. He was 4 years older, confident in the way people are when the world has always bent slightly in their favor. Growing up, my parents referred to him as strong-willed. I was sensitive. I hear you've been distant, he said. I've been busy. With what he asked already annoyed. My life, a short laugh. Look, Mom and Dad are worried. You're acting secretive. I thought of the voicemail. I'm allowed to have privacy. Not when it affects the family, he said. There it was again. Family as a justification, as a border that only moved in one direction. Does it affect you? I asked. He hesitated, just long enough. Grandpa wouldn't have wanted things complicated, he said. Whatever he left, it should be handled fairly. I leaned back against my kitchen counter. Fair according to who? According to us, he said, as if it were obvious. After the call, I opened the letter from my grandfather again. I read the line about correction until the words lost shape and became intention. A week later, my parents showed up at my apartment unannounced. I knew it was them before I opened the door. My mother's perfume had a way of announcing her presence before her voice did. They stood there with the same posture they'd had at my kitchen table weeks earlier, side by side, united. We need to talk, my father said. I stepped aside and let them in. Not because I owed them access, but because I wanted to see how far they would go. They didn't sit. My mother paced. My father stood near the window surveying the space like he was assessing value. You've been avoiding us, my mother said. I've been setting boundaries. She flinched at the word. That's not like you. No, I agreed. It's not. My father turned to face me. We know there's a will. I didn't respond. We know you met with an attorney, he continued. And we know Grandpa wouldn't exclude us intentionally. I folded my arms. You're right. He didn't exclude you. Then why won't you tell us anything? My mother asked, her voice rising. Because it's not yours, I said. Silence filled the room. Thick, uncomfortable. My father's face hardened. You're being ungrateful. For what? For everything we've done for you, my mother snapped. For raising you. For supporting you. For guiding you. For controlling me, I corrected. My mother stared at me like I had slapped her. That's a cruel thing to say. It's an accurate one. My father stepped forward. This isn't how family works. No, I said. This is exactly how it has worked. I'm just not playing my part anymore. They left shortly after. No resolution, no understanding. Just a promise unspoken but clear that this was not over. That night my lawyer called. Your parents contacted our office, she said. I closed my eyes and they asked if they could represent the family collectively in matters relating to the estate. And you said? I said no. And then I suggested they seek independent counsel. There it was, the line drawn in ink, not emotion. After the call, I sat alone in my bedroom, the city humming beyond the window. I thought about Aaron, about the life I had let go because I believed stability was something given, not claimed. I understood now that my parents hadn't asked me to divorce because of money. They had asked because they thought they could. And for most of my life, they had been right. The cease and desist letter arrived on a Thursday. It was not dramatic, no raised voices, no confrontation. Just an envelope addressed to my parents' home written in language so neutral it felt almost polite. It stated clearly and without apology that all communication regarding my grandfather's estate was to go through my legal counsel. It outlined boundaries. It established consequences. I did not tell them it was coming. I wanted to see how they reacted when control was removed without explanation. My mother called that evening. I let it ring. She called again. I let it ring. Then my father. Then my brother. Then my sister-in-law, who had never called me directly before. I answered none of them. The next morning, my mother sent a text. How could you do this to us? I read it once. Then again. Then I placed the phone face down on my desk and went to work. For the first time, I noticed how often my thoughts used to orbit my parents' reactions. How decisions came pre-filtered through whether they would approve. Removing that layer felt disorienting, like walking without gravity for a moment before finding balance. At lunch, my lawyer emailed, Your parents' attorney reached out. They are disputing capacity and influence. I stared at the screen. Capacity meant they were questioning my grandfather's mental state. Influence meant they were implying someone had manipulated him. That someone by default was me. I didn't feel angry. I felt cold. Because this was not about grief. This was not about fairness. This was about access. I asked my lawyer what that meant practically. It means they are willing to attack the man's legacy to get to the money, she said, and they are willing to position you as the problem. I thought of my grandfather's handwriting, the steadiness of it, the clarity of his words. They won't win, I said. No, she agreed, but they can make it exhausting. That night I dreamed I was back in my childhood home. Every door led to another room with my parents waiting, asking me to explain myself. I woke before answering. The next few weeks were a study in escalation. My parents stopped calling and started emailing. Long messages, carefully constructed, filled with legal language they barely understood, and emotional pressure they wielded expertly. They reminded me of holidays I had enjoyed, of sacrifices they claimed to have made, of how disappointed my grandfather would be in how I was behaving now. That last one almost made me laugh, almost. I did not respond. Instead, I did something I had never done before. I booked a session with a therapist and told the truth without softening it. I talked about how love in my family had always come with expectations attached, how silence was punished, how compliance was praised as maturity, how resistance was framed as cruelty. She listened without interruption. Then she said, You were trained, not raised. The sentence landed harder than any accusation my parents had made. A week later, my brother showed up at my office. Security called me down to the lobby. I considered refusing. Then I decided I wanted to see him outside the structure of our family narrative. He looked uncomfortable, out of place, less confident than he sounded on the phone. This is extreme, he said as soon as we sat. What is lawyers, letters, cutting people off? I met his eyes. You called me to tell me Grandpa's will should be handled fairly. What did you mean? He shifted in his seat, evenly. Between who? Between family, he said. Which family, I asked. Because Grandpa made his choice. That doesn't make it right. No, I agreed. It makes it his. He leaned forward. Mom is barely sleeping. Dad is furious. You're tearing this family apart. I thought of my marriage, of the quiet way it had ended, of how no one had asked me how I was sleeping then. I didn't tear anything apart, I said. I stopped holding it together. He stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. You've changed. Yes. He left without saying goodbye. That evening, I received an email from my parents' attorney requesting mediation. My lawyer asked what I wanted to do. I thought carefully before answering. I want to hear what they're willing to say when it's on record, I said. The mediation was scheduled for the following month. In the meantime, the estate documents continued to unfold. My grandfather had left instructions I was still discovering. Charitable foundations, trust structures, a board seat I hadn't expected, and a clause that made my breath catch when I read it. In the event of any challenge to the will by immediate family, all contested assets would remain frozen until resolution, and any party found to have acted in bad faith would be permanently excluded from future discretionary trusts. He had anticipated this, not because he distrusted me, because he understood them. I closed the file and sat back in my chair. Outside, the city moved on as it always had. Inside, something settled into place. This was no longer about inheritance. It was about authorship. For the first time, the story of my life was not being edited by people who believed love meant ownership. The mediation took place in a conference room that smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and stale coffee. Neutral ground, they called it. Nothing about it felt neutral to me. I arrived early. Not out of nerves, but out of habit. For years, I had learned that being prepared was a form of armor. I sat at the table with my lawyer beside me, my folder neatly arranged, my phone silenced. When my parents walked in, they stopped short, as if surprised to see me already settled. My mother looked thinner. Or maybe I was finally seeing her without the soft focus of obligation. My father's jaw was tight, his posture rigid. My brother followed behind them, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the room like he was hoping for an exit. No one hugged me. That absence spoke louder than any greeting. The mediator, a woman with a calm voice and an expensive watch, explained the process. Ground rules. Respect. One person speaking at a time. I listened carefully, even though I already knew how this would go. My parents' attorney spoke first. He outlined their position with professional detachment. Concerns about undue influence, questions about capacity, a desire for transparency and fairness. Fairness again. The word had become elastic in their mouths. When it was my turn, my lawyer asked if I wanted to speak directly. I did. I didn't ask for this meeting, I said. My voice was steady. But since we're here, I want to be clear. My grandfather made his decisions independently. I respected them. I am respecting them still. I will not redistribute what was intentionally left to me. My mother inhaled sharply. You make it sound so cold. I looked at her, really looked. It's not cold, it's precise. My father leaned forward. We are your parents. Yes, I said, and that relationship does not entitle you to my autonomy. The mediator raised a hand gently, but my father waved her off. We didn't raise you to be like this, he said. No, I replied. You raised me to comply. I grew into something else. Silence stretched. My brother cleared his throat. Maybe he said carefully there's a compromise, some gesture, a trust, a distribution. I turned to him. Would you be asking this if Grandpa had left everything to you? He didn't answer. The mediator tried again. What would resolution look like for you? She asked my parents. My mother's eyes filled. Not with tears exactly, with something sharper. Resolution, she said, would be knowing our daughter hasn't abandoned us for money. I felt something shift in my chest. Not guilt, recognition. I didn't choose money over you, I said. You chose money over me long before this. That was when my father stood up. This is pointless, he said. She's been poisoned against us. My lawyer placed a hand on my arm, a quiet signal. The mediator called a break. In the hallway, my mother approached me alone. No witnesses, no attorneys. You don't have to do this, she said. You can still fix this. I met her eyes. Fix what? Us, she said. I thought of the kitchen table, the divorce papers. The way she had said this isn't about feelings. You're right, I said softly. I don't have to do this, that's the point. When the mediation resumed, my parents withdrew their request for compromise. Their attorney cited irreconcilable differences and indicated they would proceed with formal challenge. My lawyer nodded unsurprised. As we packed up, the mediator looked at me with something like respect, or maybe relief. Outside, the air felt cleaner, lighter. "They're going to push," my lawyer said as we walked to the parking lot. "But they're not strong legally. They're strong emotionally." "I know," I said. "They always have been." Over the next month, the challenge moved forward. Filings, motions, delays. My parents' attorney requested depositions. They wanted access to emails, calendars, travel records, anything that could suggest influence. My grandfather had anticipated that too. The records showed limited contact, no unusual financial transfers, no sudden changes in behavior. His doctor provided affidavits. His accountant confirmed long-standing intentions. Each attempt to poke holes only reinforced the structure. At the same time, something else happened, quietly. My parents' social circle shifted. I heard about it through a cousin who still spoke to me. How my mother complained at dinner parties about ungrateful children. How my father hinted at betrayal without details. How people listened politely then changed the subject. Money attracts sympathy, but entitlement repels it. One afternoon, my lawyer called with an update. "They're backing down," she said. "They'll withdraw the challenge." I closed my eyes, not in relief, in acceptance. "There's a condition," she added. "They want to save face. A statement about mutual respect." "No," I said. She paused. "You're sure?" "Yes." The withdrawal was filed the following week. No announcement, no apology, just a quiet retreat. My parents did not call. Instead, my brother sent a text. "I hope this was worth it." I stared at the message for a long time before replying. It was. That evening, I walked through my apartment, touching the walls, the furniture, the life I was finally inhabiting fully. I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker on. I thought about revenge. How people imagine it as confrontation or humiliation. Yelling, winning. This wasn't that. This was consequence. They had treated my life like a resource to be managed. I had removed it from their control. That was the only payback that mattered. For the first time, the silence from my family did not feel like punishment. It felt like space. And in that space, something new was beginning to form. The silence lasted longer than I expected. Not days, not weeks, months. At first, I kept waiting for it to break. For a birthday text, a holiday email, some thin excuse to reopen the line they had lost. But as summer turned into fall, it became clear that the silence was not accidental. It was strategic. They were waiting for me to flinch. I didn't. Instead, I watched what happened when no one was narrating my life for me anymore. My routines shifted. I started waking earlier, not out of anxiety, but because my body was no longer bracing for interruption. I took longer walks after work. I stopped explaining my choices to people who hadn't asked. The estate work continued quietly in the background. Board meetings, asset reviews, legal housekeeping. None of it felt glamorous. It felt adult, responsible, grounded. One afternoon, during a routine review with my legal team, a detail surfaced that caught my attention. "There's an older family trust," my attorney said, scrolling through documents. "Separate from the main estate. Your parents are named as potential discretionary beneficiaries, but only under specific conditions." "What conditions?" I asked. She hesitated. "Maintaining a demonstrably supportive relationship with you." I let out a short breath. Define supportive. She smiled slightly. "That's the interesting part. It's intentionally vague, but the trustee has wide discretion. And you appoint the trustee." I leaned back in my chair. I didn't feel triumph. I felt something closer to grim understanding. My grandfather had not just given me resources. He had given me leverage wrapped in ethics. "What happens if the relationship is non-existent?" I asked. "Then distributions are unlikely," she said. I nodded once. Good. That night I received my first message from my mother in months. It was short. "We should talk." No apology, no warmth, just a request framed as inevitability. I didn't answer immediately. I waited until the next morning, then replied with one sentence. "If you'd like to put something in writing, you can email my attorney." The response was immediate. "This is ridiculous. I'm your mother." I stared at the screen, feeling the old reflex stir, the urge to smooth, to reassure, to absorb. I let it pass. Instead of replying, I forwarded the message to my lawyer and closed the app. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived, handwritten. My mother's handwriting unmistakable. She wrote about missing me, about not understanding how things had gone so wrong, about how families forgive, about how my grandfather would have wanted unity. She did not mention the divorce, or the money, or the lawsuit, or the cease and desist. She wrote as if none of it had happened. That omission told me more than any confession could have. I read the letter once, then I placed it in a folder labeled personal and locked it away. Not because it hurt, but because it was incomplete. Around the same time, I ran into Aaron. It was at a grocery store of all places. I was choosing apples when I heard my name. He looked well. Tired maybe, but steady. We talked briefly, about work, about the city, about nothing that mattered. I heard about your grandfather, he said. Yes. I hope you're okay. I am, I said, and meant it. He hesitated. I didn't understand back then why you did what you did. I didn't either, I said. He nodded. I'm sorry. So am I replied. We parted without drama, without closure, but without resentment either. That too felt like progress. The next escalation came quietly. My father contacted the trustee directly. It wasn't illegal, just inappropriate. A reminder that boundaries once set must be enforced. The trustee notified me immediately, provided a summary of the conversation. My father had asked about timelines, about expectations, about what it would take to repair the relationship. The trustee's response had been brief. Actions, not words. I authorized a formal notice reinforcing that any further attempts to circumvent established channels would be documented and considered in future discretionary decisions. When my father received it, he did not respond. Instead, my brother called. You're enjoying this, he said without greeting. No, I said, I'm ending it. You've got all the power now, he accused. I always had it, I replied. I just didn't know. He was quiet for a moment. Mom is having a hard time. I believe that, I said, so did I. Another pause. What do you want from us? The question was almost sincere. I want honesty, I said, and accountability, without conditions. That's not how families work, he said. That's how adults do, I replied. After the call, I sat alone in my living room, the late afternoon light slanting across the floor. I thought about revenge again. About how easily it could have tipped into cruelty if I had wanted it to. But this wasn't cruelty. This was containment. My parents had spent my life expanding into every corner of my choices. Now they were experiencing what it felt like to be limited. And for the first time, I understood something my grandfather had known all along. Power doesn't need to announce itself. It just needs to hold. The first holiday without my family arrived quietly. Thanksgiving had always been a performance in our house. The right dishes, the right seating order. Conversation steered away from anything uncomfortable and back toward appearances. Gratitude carefully curated. This year I spent it alone. Not because I had nowhere to go. I had invitations. Friends who knew pieces of the story and offered warmth without questions. I declined them all. I needed to feel the emptiness without rushing to fill it. I roasted a small turkey I didn't really know how to season properly. I opened a bottle of wine I had been saving without a reason. I ate at my kitchen counter, standing, then sitting, then standing again. It was imperfect. It was quiet. It was mine. Midway through the afternoon, my phone buzzed. A group text. My parents, my brother, a photo of their table, everyone smiling. My mother's message followed a moment later. Wish you were here. Family is everything. I stared at the screen, feeling something rise in my chest that surprised me. Not sadness. Anger. Not loud anger. Not explosive anger. The kind that arrives after clarity, when you realize someone is trying to rewrite the present using the language of the past. I didn't respond. Instead, I took a photo of my half-eaten plate, the city visible through the window behind it. I didn't send it to them. I saved it. Proof for myself that solitude did not equal abandonment. The next morning, my lawyer called. There's been another development, she said. Your parents' attorney reached out again. They're asking about reinstating communication. Informally. I laughed once quietly. On what terms? None stated, she said. Which is the problem? I considered it. Then I said draft a response. Tell them I'm open to communication under 3 conditions, which are everything in writing, no intermediaries, and acknowledgement of the divorce ultimatum. She paused. You want them to admit that? Yes, because that was the fracture point. The moment where love had been replaced by leverage. If they couldn't name it, then nothing else mattered. The response went out that afternoon. The reply came 2 days later, a long email from my mother. She wrote about misunderstanding, about intentions, about how parents sometimes make mistakes when they're scared for their children. She did not use the word ultimatum. She did not use the word money. She described the divorce as a suggestion poorly communicated. I read it twice, slowly. Then I forwarded it to my lawyer with one line. This doesn't meet the conditions. Her reply was immediate. Agreed. That evening, I received a message from a number I didn't recognize. It was my aunt, my mother's sister, the quiet one, the one who always arrived early and left before dessert. I wasn't sure how she had gotten my new number. Your mother is unraveling, the message read. She doesn't understand how this happened. I typed erase, typed again. She understands, I wrote, finally. She just doesn't accept it. A minute passed. Then another message. Your grandfather trusted you for a reason. I stared at the words until they blurred slightly. That night, I pulled out the letter again, the one my grandfather had written. I read it from beginning to end, then once more. When I finished, I did something I hadn't planned to do. I wrote back, not to him, to myself. I wrote about the kitchen table, the coffee gone cold, the way my parents had spoken about $1 million like it was owed to them by proxy. I wrote about Aaron's face when I told him I wanted a divorce, about how I had confused compliance with survival. I wrote until my hand cramped. Then I placed the pages in the same safe as the letter. Documentation, my lawyer had said, but some things are documented for reasons beyond evidence. The next escalation came from an unexpected direction. My company announced a restructuring, a new board seat, one that aligned uncomfortably well with my grandfather's old firm. Industry overlap, strategic partnerships. I was asked informally if I would consider representing my personal interests as part of the discussion. It was the first time my professional life and my inheritance intersected publicly. I said yes. The news traveled faster than I expected. Within days, my brother called again. You didn't tell us about this, he said. I don't tell you about most things, I replied. You're putting our name out there, he said. People are talking. They've always talked, I said. You're just not controlling the narrative anymore. He exhaled sharply. Do you know how this looks? Yes, I said. It looks like independence. Silence. Then quietly, Dad thinks you're doing this to punish him. I considered that. I'm doing this because I can, I said. After the call, I sat in my office long after everyone else had left. The building was quiet, the city below restless. I thought about revenge again, how it's often portrayed as fire and noise. This wasn't fire. This was elevation. Every step I took without them exposed how much of my life they had assumed would always orbit theirs. Every decision made without consultation was a small rupture in their certainty, not because I was trying to hurt them, but because I was no longer trying to protect them from the truth. That truth I was learning was harder for them than any punishment I could have designed. As winter settled in, something inside me hardened into resolve. I was done negotiating my adulthood, and soon I would make that clear in a way they could not ignore. The invitation arrived in early December, tucked between utility bills and holiday catalogs. It was embossed, thick paper, heavy enough to signal importance before I read a single word. A charity gala. Black tie. End of year. Hosted by one of the foundations my grandfather had funded quietly for decades. A foundation I now chaired, though very few people knew that yet. At the bottom of the page in elegant type, it listed the honorary hosts. My parents' names were not there. That omission was not accidental. I didn't smile when I noticed it. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, as if a long equation had finally balanced itself. 2 days later, my mother called. I let it ring. She left a voicemail this time. Her voice was different, controlled but strained at the edges. We received an invitation, she said. Or rather, we didn't. People are asking questions. We need to talk before this goes any further. Before this goes any further. As if distance were a threat, not a consequence. I listened to the message once, then I deleted it. The gala became the topic of quiet conversations I wasn't part of. Friends mentioned it casually. Colleagues asked if I was attending. I said yes without elaboration. I did not warn my family. I did not explain. I did not soften the ground. That night, as I stood in front of my mirror, adjusting a dress I had chosen myself without sending a photo to anyone for approval, I felt something unfamiliar settle over me. Not confidence, authority. The venue was a restored historic building downtown. Marble floors, high ceilings, the kind of place designed to make people lower their voices instinctively. I arrived alone. No escort, no entourage. Inside, I was greeted by the foundation's director, who thanked me for my leadership and guided me toward the main room. The room was full. Executives, donors, board members, judges. People my parents had spent their lives trying to impress from a distance. people who knew my grandfather not as a rumor but as a peer. I felt eyes turn toward me, some curious, some surprised, a few already knowing. I moved through the space slowly, deliberately. I shook hands. I listened more than I spoke. I noticed who approached me first. It wasn't who I expected. Halfway through the evening, as speeches began, I felt a shift in the air. A subtle tightening. The kind that happens when something unscripted enters a carefully managed space. I turned. My parents had arrived. They were dressed impeccably. As always. My mother's smile was fixed, practiced. My father's expression tight, assessing. They stood near the entrance, scanning the room, looking for allies. They did not find many. I watched as people acknowledged them politely, then redirected their attention elsewhere. Conversations ended quickly. Introductions were brief. The social temperature had changed. They spotted me near the front of the room. For a moment, my mother looked almost relieved, as if my presence confirmed that this was still a family matter that could be handled privately. She approached me quickly. "You didn't tell us you'd be here," she said, breathless. "I was invited," I replied. My father joined her. "This is inappropriate," he said quietly. "We should discuss this later." "There's nothing to discuss," I said. My mother's smile faltered. "People are confused. They think you're in charge." I met her eyes. "I am." The announcement began before she could respond. The director took the stage and spoke about legacy, about stewardship, about the importance of honoring intent, not entitlement. I felt my parents stiffen beside me. Then my name was called. I stepped forward. The room quieted. I spoke briefly, thanked the donors, acknowledged the foundation's mission, spoke about my grandfather in simple terms, his belief in quiet impact, his respect for independence. I did not mention my parents. I did not need to. When I finished, the applause was warm, sustained, respectful. As I stepped down, I saw my father's face change. Not anger, not shock. Recognition. He understood in that moment that this was not a misunderstanding, not a phase, not a rebellion that could be waited out. This was structural. After the event, as guests filtered out, my parents cornered me near the coat check. "You're humiliating us," my mother hissed. "I didn't say a word about you," I replied. "That's the problem," my father said. Yes, I agreed. They looked at me like strangers. Because that's what happens when control is mistaken for intimacy and then removed. My mother reached for my arm. I stepped back. "We raised you," she said. "We made you." "No," I said calmly. "You shaped me. I made myself." She stared at me, searching for something familiar, something she could still influence. She didn't find it. I left without another word. Outside, the night air was sharp, clean. I took a deep breath and felt it fill my lungs without resistance. This was not revenge in the way stories like to dramatize it. This was repositioning. They had spent years managing my image as an extension of theirs. Tonight, that illusion collapsed quietly in front of the very audience they valued most. Not because I attacked them, but because I stood exactly where they believed I never could without them. And for the first time, I understood that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply takes the microphone when it's offered and refuses to hand it back. The fallout didn't come all at once. It arrived in fragments, a delayed reaction, a series of small telling absences that revealed more than any confrontation could have. The first sign was Christmas. For as long as I could remember, my mother had hosted it like a ceremony. Same house, same tablecloth, same seating arrangement. Even when people fought, they showed up. Attendance was loyalty. This year there was no invitation. Not a message, not a passive-aggressive card, nothing. At first I wondered if it was a test. A way to see if I would reach out, apologize, fold myself back into place. When the day arrived and passed without contact, I understood it for what it was. They weren't punishing me. They were protecting themselves. I spent Christmas morning walking through the city while most people were still asleep. Streets quiet, storefronts dark, the air cold enough to keep thoughts sharp. I bought coffee from a corner shop run by a man who didn't know my name or my history and wished me a good holiday without expectation. That afternoon, my brother texted, "Dad says this has gone too far." I stared at the message, then set the phone down. I didn't respond. 2 days later, my lawyer called again. "Your parents have requested an accounting," she said. "Not legally required, but they're pushing." "Of what?" "Your grandfather's charitable allocations. They're framing it as concern about mismanagement." I exhaled slowly. "And what do you recommend?" "We deny it," she said, politely, firmly. "Do it," I said. After the call, I sat at my desk and opened a file I hadn't touched in weeks. A summary of my grandfather's estate plan, including the discretionary trust my parents were no longer eligible for. I reread the clause carefully. Supportive relationship, good faith, no coercion. I hadn't written those words, but I was living them. A week later, my aunt called. Not the quiet one this time, the outspoken one. The one who always said what others were thinking and then claimed she was just being honest. I don't agree with how you're handling this, she said without greeting. I didn't ask you to, I replied. She sighed. Your parents are embarrassed. They feel pushed out. They pushed first, I said. That's not how they see it. I know. She paused. You know, people are starting to talk about you like you're cold. I smiled, though she couldn't see it. That's fine. Is it? She asked. You don't worry about how this looks. No, I said. I worry about how it feels. Another pause, longer this time. You used to be so accommodating, she said. I used to be afraid, I replied. She didn't have a response for that. The professional consequences of the gala began to unfold quietly. Invitations followed. Meetings. Introductions that no longer came through my parents. I was no longer a bridge. I was a destination. At one lunch, a woman who had known my family for years leaned across the table and said, Your grandfather always spoke highly of you. He worried they didn't see you clearly. I nodded, saying nothing, because clarity is not something you can argue someone into. It arrives when conditions change. Late January, my father sent his first email since the gala. It was short. We need to reset. This has become unhealthy. I read it once, then again. Unhealthy. As if the issue were the boundary, not the behavior that made it necessary. I forwarded it to my lawyer. Response. Her reply came quickly. No response is a response, so I didn't reply. That was the moment something shifted. Not in them. In me. I realized I was no longer waiting. Not for an apology. Not for understanding. Not for reconciliation. I had crossed a line where their approval no longer felt relevant to my sense of self. That night I dreamed of my grandfather again. We were sitting on the porch of his house, the old one with the wide steps and the creaking swing. He wasn't speaking, just watching the trees move in the wind. When I woke, I felt rested, not nostalgic, grounded. The next escalation came unexpectedly. A legal notice. Not from my parents. From a business entity they were involved in. They were suing the foundation, not for money, for access. The claim was technical. Alleged breach of donor intent. A strategy designed to force disclosure and regain relevance. My lawyer's voice was calm when she explained it. They're trying to get leverage indirectly, she said. It's weak, but it's hostile. I closed my eyes. Do we fight? I asked. Yes, she said, and we counter. With what? With the truth, she replied, and with consequences. The board convened an emergency session. I attended. I listened. I spoke only when necessary. We voted unanimously to sever all remaining informal ties with any entities associated with my parents. Funding paused. Partnerships dissolved. Clean, legal, final. When the notice went out, my brother called again. This time his voice was different. You didn't have to go that far, he said. Yes, I replied, I did. You're burning bridges, he said. No, I said calmly. I'm closing doors that were never meant to stay open. He was silent for a long time. Then quietly, they don't recognize you anymore. I know, I said, that's the point. After the call, I sat alone in my apartment, the lights low, the city humming beyond the glass. I thought about revenge one last time. Not as a fantasy, as a question. Was this revenge, or was it simply the inevitable result of choosing myself in a system that depended on my compliance? The answer came easily. Revenge requires fixation. This required release. They had mistaken my patience for permission, my silence for agreement, my loyalty for availability. I had removed myself from the equation, and in doing so, I had done the one thing they could never forgive. I had proven that I didn't need them to exist. Soon they would understand something else. That power once lost does not return just because it is demanded. And the final act of this story was already in motion. The lawsuit collapsed faster than I expected. Not because my parents lacked persistence, but because they lacked standing. The claim, stripped of emotional language and examined under fluorescent legal light, amounted to frustration disguised as principle. The Foundation's counsel dismantled it methodically. Motive exposed, precedent cited, doors closed. When the dismissal notice came through, I didn't celebrate. I forwarded it to the board, approved a short public statement reaffirming mission continuity, and moved on to the next agenda item. That was the pattern now. Respond, resolve, proceed. It unnerved people who were used to drama. The personal response came later, and it came sideways. My parents sold their house. I learned about it the way you learn about other people's lives, once you've been removed from them through a third party, phrased casually as if it were a weather update. They're downsizing, a cousin said over the phone, said they want a fresh start. A fresh start was what you called it when the old structure no longer worked. The house had been more than a home. It was a symbol. The place where holidays were hosted, decisions announced, authority staged. Selling it wasn't just practical. It was an admission, whether they knew it or not, that something irreversible had happened. A week later, my mother emailed again. The tone had changed. No accusations, no guilt, just exhaustion. I don't recognize my life anymore, she wrote. I don't know how we got here. I read it carefully, slowly, looking for accountability. It wasn't there. She described loss without cause, pain without origin, confusion without responsibility. I closed the laptop. That evening, I attended a small dinner hosted by a colleague. Nothing formal. 8 people, good food, conversation that wandered and returned without tension. At one point, someone asked about my family. I answered honestly but briefly. We're not close right now. No one pushed. No one filled the silence with advice. They accepted the statement as complete. That acceptance felt like oxygen. As winter eased into early spring, my schedule shifted again. The board asked me to take on a more visible role, public-facing, strategic. A vote of confidence that felt earned, not inherited. I said yes. The announcement triggered another wave of attention. Interviews, profiles. The narrative coalesced quickly, and not in a way my parents could control. Independent, measured, principled. Words that had never been used for me before. My brother reached out less frequently now. When he did, the messages were shorter, less combative, more tentative. One night, he called unexpectedly. I don't think they're going to change, he said without context. I know, I replied. I thought if I explained it differently, if I helped them see. You can't see for someone who refuses to look, I said. He sighed. They think you're waiting for something, an apology, a gesture. I'm not, I said. What are you waiting for then? I considered the question, nothing. The word felt solid, complete. After the call, I sat at my desk and opened the safe. I took out my grandfather's letter and my own handwritten pages. I reread them not for reassurance but for continuity. This was the through line, the point where the story stopped being reactive and became authored. The next development arrived with less subtlety. My parents requested a meeting. Not through attorneys, not through intermediaries. Directly. The email was joint, signed by both of them. We would like to meet in person. Neutral location. 1 hour. No lawyers. I forwarded it to my therapist. Her response was simple. What would meeting them cost you? I thought about it carefully. Not emotionally, practically. An hour, energy, attention. And the risk of reopening something I had already sealed. I wrote back to my parents. I'm willing to meet under one condition. We speak about the past accurately, not comfortably. Their reply came the next day. Agreed. We chose a cafe halfway between our neighborhoods. Public, bright, no corners to retreat into. They arrived early. I arrived on time. We sat across from each other like strangers negotiating terms. My mother spoke first. We never meant to hurt you, she said. I waited. She continued. We thought we were protecting you. From what I asked. She faltered. From instability. I nodded. And when you threatened to withdraw support unless I divorced my husband, my father shifted. That wasn't a threat. It was an ultimatum, I said. Silence. Finally, my mother said we were wrong. The words were quiet, unadorned, no explanation attached. I felt something ease, not forgiveness, recognition. And the money I asked. My father looked at the table. We assumed. We shouldn't have. And the lawsuit. He swallowed. We panicked. I let the silence stretch, not to punish them, to see if they would fill it with truth. They didn't. After a moment I spoke. I'm not rebuilding this relationship, I said. Not right now. Maybe not ever. My mother's eyes filled. She didn't cry. What do you want then? She asked. I want distance without hostility, I said, and honesty without access. My father nodded slowly. That may be the best we can do. I agree, I said. We stood, no hugs, no promises. As I walked away, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not loss. Completion. That night alone in my apartment, I poured a glass of water and stood by the window. The city below moved on indifferent and alive. I thought about the word revenge one last time. This wasn't revenge. This was boundaries enforced until they became permanent. This was choosing clarity over comfort, integrity over approval, self over script. And the final chapter was no longer about what they would do next. It was about what I would build now that nothing was holding me back. The story was no longer reacting. It was moving forward. After the meeting, nothing dramatic happened. That was the most unsettling part. No angry emails, no late-night calls, no sudden reversals. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It wasn't tactical, it wasn't performative. It was acceptance or something close enough to it that I didn't need to argue the difference. Days passed, then weeks. I kept expecting an aftershock, some delayed attempt to renegotiate the terms we'd set in that cafe. But my parents stayed within the boundaries for once. Not because they suddenly respected them, I suspected, but because they had finally understood that crossing them would cost more than they could afford. At work, things accelerated. The visibility I had stepped into began to solidify into authority. Decisions came across my desk that would have once gone to people twice my age. I noticed how often I was asked not just what I thought, but what I wanted to do. That distinction mattered. I hired a small team. People who didn't know my family name, or if they did, didn't care. People who responded to clarity, not hierarchy. I learned quickly that leadership felt very different when it wasn't borrowed. One afternoon during a routine review, my assistant mentioned an inquiry. "Someone from your parents' circle reached out," she said carefully. "They were asking if you were open to reconnecting." I considered it. "Did they say why?" She shook her head. "Just interest." "Decline politely," I said. "No explanation." She nodded, already moving on. That ease surprised me. How natural it felt to say no without rehearsing it first. Without guilt. Without justification. I thought about my grandfather again. About the way he had lived in quiet contradiction to the family narrative. Present, but never entangled. Generous, but never available for manipulation. I understood him now. Late spring brought another milestone. The final transfer of estate responsibilities. The last signatures. The closing of a chapter that had technically begun years before any of us knew it. My lawyer slid the final document across the table. "This is it," she said. "No remaining contingencies." I signed without ceremony. When I left her office, I didn't feel lighter. I felt anchored. That evening, my brother called. He hadn't done that in months. "I just wanted you to know," he said, "they're moving out of state." I paused. "When?" "Soon. Dad says a change of environment might help." "Help what?" I asked. He exhaled. "I don't know, them." There was something almost vulnerable in his voice. I realized then that he too had lost something in all of this. Not control like my parents, but certainty. The belief that family structures were permanent, unshakable. "Are you okay?" I asked him. He hesitated. "I don't know." "That's honest," I said. "It's a start." We talked for a few more minutes. About neutral things. Logistics. Weather. Nothing heavy. When we hung up, I felt no urgency to analyze the call. It was simply what it was. The next message from my mother came as a postcard, a photograph of a coastline I didn't recognize. Just a few words on the back. "We're settling in. I hope you're well." No questions, no subtext, no attempt to pull me back in. I placed it on my desk and left it there. Not as a trophy, as evidence. That summer, I took my first real vacation alone. Not a trip scheduled around obligations or appearances. I chose a place because I wanted to see it. I stayed longer than planned because no one was waiting on me to return. One morning, sitting on a balcony overlooking the water, I realized I hadn't thought about my parents in days. Not in avoidance. In absence. The space they had once occupied in my mind had been reclaimed by other things. Curiosity. Focus. Calm. When I returned home, my apartment felt like a sanctuary rather than a stopover. I rearranged furniture. Gave away things I'd been holding on to out of habit. I made room without consciously trying to. That was when I understood something important. Revenge stories always end with a moment of victory. A visible defeat. A clear winner and loser. This story didn't offer that. There was no single moment where I stood over the wreckage of someone else's choices and felt justified. No speech. No reckoning. There was just a steady accumulation of decisions that favored truth over comfort. And in that accumulation, something irreversible had happened. I no longer measured my life against theirs. I no longer waited for permission to feel settled. I had crossed from reaction into authorship so gradually that I hadn't noticed the moment it became permanent. The final test came quietly. An email from my father. Just one line. "I hope you know we did love you." I stared at it for a long time. Then I replied, "I know. I just needed it not to cost me myself." He didn't respond. And for the first time, I didn't wonder why. Because love, I had learned, is not proven by proximity or sacrifice demanded of one side only. It is proven by what survives when control is removed. That night I slept deeply, without dreams, without rehearsals. And when I woke, I didn't feel like someone recovering from a battle. I felt like someone living inside the life she had finally chosen. The ending was close now, not because everything was resolved, but because nothing was unresolved enough to own me anymore. People like to ask how it ended. They expect a moment, a line, something definitive they can hold on to and repeat as proof that justice has a shape they recognize. I never know how to answer them because nothing ended all at once. What happened instead was quieter. Life kept moving and I stopped dragging my past behind me like an anchor. The work I had stepped into grew more demanding but also more aligned. I learned the difference between being busy and being useful, between recognition and respect. I chose projects that reflected my values rather than my last name. When people asked about my family, I answered without apology and without performance. We're not close, I would say, and that was enough. My parents stayed out of my orbit, not because they suddenly understood everything, but because distance had become the only way they could preserve their version of dignity. I didn't chase them. I didn't block them either. I let the space exist exactly as it was. My brother and I spoke occasionally, carefully, without old scripts. Sometimes that was all reconciliation looked like. Not repair, but adjustment. I thought about Aaron once in a while. Not with regret, with clarity. We had both been collateral in a dynamic neither of us fully saw at the time. I hoped he had found peace that didn't require negotiation. On the anniversary of my grandfather's death, I visited the property alone. I walked the grounds slowly, remembering small details. The sound of the porch swing. The way he used to listen more than he spoke. I sat on the steps and read his letter one last time. The inheritance was not a reward but a correction. I understood now what he meant. The money had not changed who I was. It had simply removed the consequences of choosing myself. It had given me room to see the truth without fear of losing everything. Not everyone gets that kind of correction. Before I left, I stood and looked back at the house, feeling no obligation to preserve it as a shrine. Just gratitude for what it had made possible. Back home, I returned to my routines: work, friends, quiet evenings. A life that no longer required explanation. One night, scrolling through messages, I noticed something that made me pause. A comment on a public interview I had done weeks earlier. She didn't destroy her family, she refused to be owned by it. I closed the app and sat with that sentence, because that was the story stripped of drama and numbers and legal filings. I had been raised to believe that love meant obedience and loyalty meant silence, that choosing myself was a betrayal rather than a responsibility. I had been wrong. The moment I stopped negotiating my worth, everything else reorganized around that decision. Not because I won, but because I walked away from a game that only worked if I kept losing. If there is a lesson here, it isn't about inheritance or lawsuits or revenge. It's about boundaries, about recognizing when affection is conditional and choosing not to pay the price. About understanding that family can be a source of strength, but it should never be a cage. I didn't become harder through this process. I became clearer. Clear about what I would tolerate. Clear about what I would protect. Clear about the fact that peace does not come from keeping everyone comfortable. It comes from being intact. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself in any part of it, know this: you are allowed to step back. You are allowed to say no without offering a defense. You are allowed to choose the version of your life that does not require you to disappear inside it. That choice will cost you something. It will also give you everything else. If this story resonated with you, if you've lived through something similar, or are standing at the edge of a decision you've been avoiding, you're not alone. Share your thoughts, tell your story, stay connected. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't payback, it's freedom. And choosing yourself calmly and completely is the one decision no one else ever gets to make for you.